The development of the church as a unified social institution postdates the development of the church, and more importantly for our purposes, postdates the social influence of the church. The early church in the years following Jesus' death and resurrection began to grow in and around Jerusalem. However, this growth explodes as a result of the persecution of early Christians by Jews, and as a result of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Historian Mark Knoll marks this as the first major turning point in church history. It is at this point that the early church begins to become distinct and separate from the structures of Judaism. This is largely due to the missionary efforts of the early church and the need and desire to plant churches in cities and regions that were predominantly Gentile. As we've noted before, this period of the church in transit also displayed developments in theology, early stages of canonization of sacred texts, and early church organization and offices. The earliest institutional elements of church life can be seen in the establishment of bishops as the primary human authorities in various regions. Early church fathers such as Irenaeus and Ignatius enumerated the succession of bishops from the time of the 12 original apostles to their own present day in the mid to late 2nd century. This demonstrates that there was both a need and desire for the early church to organize itself with this kind of hierarchical leadership structure. However, a difficulty arises historically in tracing the solidifying process of the bishopric before the 2nd century. It is quite clear from the New Testament evidence that leadership and organizational structures were very fluid in the mid to late 1st century, around the time Paul's letters and the canonical Gospels were written. We see references to a great many roles that we might call church offices today, but we do not see any systematizing or universalization of these roles in the earliest Christian communities. So the rise of and establishment of the bishops, along with the formation of some early creeds and the beginning stages of the canonization process of Scripture, provide our earliest evidence of the institutionalization of the church. But this is mostly, perhaps even primarily, organizational in nature. As we discussed back in the lecture on models of ecclesiology, some institutional elements are essential and necessary in order for the church to function. We might even find it natural that these institutional elements began to solidify as the early church continued to grow in its first 3 centuries. But if we want to examine the church as a social and political institution, we need to fast forward another century or so. There are a number of dates in the 4th century that are pertinent to this discussion of the church as a social and political institution. The first is in 312, and the event in question is the Battle of Milvian Bridge between wannabe emperors of Rome, Constantine and Maxentius. As the legend goes, it's a classic big fish kind of story, but there is some secondhand evidence from early church historian Eusebius that the legend was at least perpetrated and believed by Constantine himself. So, as the legend goes, Constantine was praying just before the battle and saw a vision in the sky of a cross of light and a message, "Conquer by this." Constantine had his blacksmiths fashion a cross emblem to his shield, and sure enough, Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, ensuring his position as a Roman emperor. This is sometimes marked as the date of Constantine's conversion. It's also sometimes debated because even with all that followed this momentous military victory, Constantine was not baptized until 337, when he was on his deathbed. The second important date comes close on the heels of Constantine's military victory. In 313, Constantine and Licinius, co-emperors at the time, issued a decree which legalized Christianity and ensured tolerance of all peaceful religions throughout the empire. Remember that up to this point in history, the early church communities were very small minorities, even though they were growing consistently. And these minority communities did not experience persecution only from Jews, such as we read about in Acts 7 and 8, but they also experienced growing persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire over the first 3 centuries of their existence. This persecution was most keen and widespread under the emperors Nero, Domitian, and Diocletian. After 313, though, Christian communities were able to effectively come out of hiding and practice their faith openly and publicly. This was aided, of course, by the spectacular conversion of one of the emperors themselves. But for Constantine, there were other motives than religious tolerance and the promulgation of the Christian faith. As Mark Knoll puts it, to Constantine, Christianity became both a way to God and a way to unite the empire. This marriage of motivations sets the stage for the syncretistic expression of institutional Christianity that dominated the Middle Ages. But before we get to the Middle Ages, we need to touch on a couple more dates in the 4th century. The first and most obvious example of Constantine's unification of political and religious power comes at the Council of Nicaea in 325. This council is important because it is the first ecumenical council in the history of the Church, involving bishops from across the Roman Empire, nearly 200 in total, gathering to deliberate matters of church theology and practice. The Council of Nicaea is also important because of its impetus. Constantine, the emperor, called for the council of bishops to meet, summoning them from across the empire. It was Constantine, not any of the bishops, who chaired the council and eventually implemented the council's directives. While the matters of discussion at Nicaea were certainly theological and ecclesial in nature, not political, it is both the theology and the politics of the church that hinge on what happens at Nicaea. It is at Nicaea that the young, growing, minority, alien and pilgrim church gets its first taste of the power of the establishment. This establishment form of Christianity would then be concretized under the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who establishes Christianity as the only legal religion of the Roman Empire. It is during this period that groundwork is laid for the institutional Roman Catholic Church as we know it in the Middle Ages. Think Crusades, imperial expansion, and consolidation of papal power. But it would be a mistake to read this kind of concrete syncretism of church and political power back into the 4th century. In the 4th century, the political and ecclesial spheres are still quite fluid, and there are many controversies and struggles among proponents of different theological and political philosophies. So while the events of 312, 313, and 325 provide a nice and neat way of summarizing a crucial shift in the life of the church, it is quite a bit more complex than I have described here. We could certainly add events from the rest of the 4th and 5th centuries to this narrative, especially as the political power of Rome declines early in the 5th century, while the ecclesial power of Rome continues to rise. The institutional elements of the church continued to solidify over the next several hundred years. And this can be seen in key events such as the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which successfully held together theological and political factions of the East and the West over the understanding of Jesus' human and divine natures. It can also be seen in the rise of monasteries over the locus of gospel-shaped as the rise of monasteries as the locus of gospel-shaped living during the period from the 5th century to the 16th century. But for the purposes of explicating the church as a social and political institution, we should briefly examine the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in the year 800, which Mark Noll refers to as the culmination of Christendom. Wrapped up in the crowning of a political figure, the Roman Emperor, by a religious figure, the Pope, and all the significance that that represents, is the rise of the papacy as the seat of religious power and the rise of Northern Europe as the seat of geopolitical power. Tracing the rise of the papacy is a difficult task and proves to be a fuzzy narrative. This contributes to our resistance to nice and neat explanations of these historical phenomena. However, historians can certainly identify expansions of papal authority in the pontificates of Leo I, also known as Leo the Great, and Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great. These were both, along with others, bishops of Rome, and it is the politically and ecclesially strategic position of Rome that allows for a context in which the person who was the Bishop of Rome was regarded unquestionably as the prime ecclesiastical figure in the West and the personal representative of Western Christianity to the East. In the geopolitical sphere, there were several events that led to a relocation of the focus of power in the Roman Empire. These events included the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula into Persia and North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries. It includes the consolidation of political rule by Charlemagne over much of North and Western Europe, and the already growing strain between the West and the East in the Church. As a result of these threads being brought together, and symbolized in the coronation of Charlemagne in 800 as Holy Roman Emperor, we can use words like synthesis, cooperation, alliance, and integration to characterize the relationship between the Church and the medieval state. Such cooperation resulted in significant growth of both papal power and political power for rulers throughout Northern and Western Europe over the next several hundred years. Now, the purpose of this lecture has been to lay a foundation on which we can build better understandings of some of the events of the Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation. How, we might ask, does the medieval church get so enthralled and intertwined in holy wars against Islam that the Crusades, as they are called, result in large-scale massacres of Muslim men, women, and children? To be fair to history, there were also massacres perpetrated by Muslim armies against Christians during this period. We can look to the coordinated motivations of church and state for a starting point to answer that question. Why does the Protestant Reformation seem to have as much to do with political power as it does with the reform of theological doctrine and practice in the church? Well, we can look to the inextricable intertwining of church and state during the Middle Ages for a starting point to answer that question. Why, after the Reformation, did religious wars dominate the historical landscape in England, France, Germany, and Spain for 150 years? We can look to the coordinated shift in political and ecclesial power toward northwestern Europe for a starting point to answer that question. The ideals and allure of the cooperation and integration of church and state will even loom large well into the 20th century. And though the majority of theologians now recognize the great danger of such an enterprise, there will be attempts at adapting or repurposing the language of Christendom. Whatever questions we will ask about the relationship between the church and other social institutions in the 21st century, we must recognize that those questions are inevitably shaped by this history of the rise of the church as the predominant social institution, with all the good and ill wrought in the process. Even when nations began disassociating with churches, and state religion has all but disappeared in the 21st century, the ethos of establishment remains. That ethos has manifested itself in churches and denominations across the United States over the last 150 years. And that ethos has crippled the social imagination of Christians and resulted in the decimation and oppression of Native Americans, black people whose ancestors were brought to this country as slaves, black and brown immigrants, and poor people of every ethnicity. Whatever positives have come from the period of church history from Constantine forward, they must always be viewed alongside this legacy of death that haunts Christendom.